So if we were to consider the ego as a player within the subject's perception of race, right? If a racist is pure subjective selfishness, and the racist is not able to separate his or herself from their own race, so the idea of race as an object doesn't even occur to them. They're unable to let go and treat the idea of race as an object that's separated from their own identity. So if you consider this as levels of attachment to your object of worship, if you hold your race as something that's pure and you irrationally need to treat it as an object of sanctity, there are various levels of attachment to the object, and there are different ways in which the subjective interprets that object that you worship, in this case, race. So you have this pure subjective selfishness level here, which we can associate with the id, right? The densest core of attachment to that object. And it demands that the object is unconditionally tolerated. And it takes whatever it can get its hands on, and it cannot let go. Right? It's the pure survival reflex, and it's the most paranoid level of attachment to the object. Then you move on to this more moderate attachment here, which still deals with race as an object. So the subject's relationship with race here is still in a situation where it's attached, but it's moved on to this more transactional phase here. And it still believes that race is something that's actually real. But in this phase here, instead of being race itself, for example, the white race or the black race or the Asian race, you're totally identified with this thing that doesn't exist. The ego transactional phase here is now able to throw it around and trade it as a commodity, right? So it's able to recognize other races and understand that each subjective individual has their own space, their own private space, and it's able to respect the other subject's own selfishness because it started to recognize its own selfishness of its own race, right? It accepts that it's not the only one in town, and that there are other races, other ethnicities and cultures, each with their own ways. And in general, it recognizes that it pays to tolerate each other's differences, right? There's a sort of mutual benefit. So the resulting philosophy here is of compromise and to tolerate each other's sort of delusions, right? Each race has its own subjective sort of flakiness or sensitivity to criticism. They sort of mutually agree to respect each other's boundaries, even though they're still delusional here, right? Race is still delusion. But they agree to keep to themselves. So the philosophy here is very live and let live. And it's more relativistic. And again, it's more transactional, because as long as I can keep to myself, I will let you do whatever you want in the privacy of your own space. But this is the first time, right? If race is pure selfishness here, this is the first time in which the subject separates from the object. It's able to let go, at least for the moment. It has some sort of self-restraint, as opposed to the id, which sees every other race as a threat to itself. So now, instead of having this conflict between the races, we're going to have, in this area here, conflict between the racist versus the anti-racist, which still operates which still revolves around race as an object, right? You're still operating within this system here, the same system that this operates in. It's just shifted a little. So we're still going to have a conflict between the racist and the anti-racist, which means that the collective is still very much operating under the assumption that race and ethnicity actually exists, rather than just something that's made up, that doesn't actually materially exist. There's no such thing as race. So this is not post-racial. This is race in its transactional phase as an object. And eventually, this object will be resolved in a way that the subject cannot imagine. These moral crusades, whether it's from the anti-racist or even the racist, that's only the subject simulating its control over its environment. The idea that we can keep ourselves safe and pure by targeting, in this case, people of other races, or racism itself, right? These savage racists. All of these moral crusades are just games intended to make the subjective perception believe that it's actually doing something, or it's actually purifying itself of a certain impurity or corruption. Right? So you can see how this problem, because it revolves around the same object here, it's self-justifying, right? It's self-reinforced. The conflict here is self-reinforcing. So neither actually has a solution, quote unquote, because they're still operating within the same level of the same object of delusion here, that race is actually an object that materially exists. So if you think this is kind of a simulation of the relativity of time, right? This eternal sort of conflict that never seems to get resolved. It doesn't get resolved because the subjective collective's free will doesn't allow for it. Because you're too busy having this conflict over what is an object that doesn't exist. So in that case, a solution is not possible. The object itself has to be destroyed. And since the subjective does not want the object to be destroyed, this conflict here, with this using this as a prop, is going to continue until something happens that's outside of the subject's intention. And there are going to be things that are going to happen that the subject thinks is going to be bad and outside of its control. That's the only way this object here gets destroyed and this delusion gets broken.